Ladies and gentlemen, this is not only now the fourth session for us, it's the fourth session for the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. I just talked to her. She had a cabinet meeting, she had a church ceremony and another event. We are very, very happy, liebe Frau Bundeskanzlerin, that you come to this place. You may know today 31 heads of state come to Berlin to see Angela Merkel. What is she doing? She is coming to us to see you. Einstein Foundation is strictly non-partisan, but I'm sure if I express the thinking of this audience, your priorities are right in this regard. Liebe Frau Bundeskanzlerin, wir freuen uns auf das, was
Madam Chancellor, we are very much looking forward to what you are about to tell us. I understand the topic of your speech is walls of the 21st century, so thank you very much for taking your time to be with us here today. Well, Professor Zöllner, Senator Zöllner, ladies and gentlemen, allow me, first of all, to tell you that I will also see my colleagues, heads of state and government today. So it's not as if I were willing to do without that pleasure, but I very much wanted to come here because I think that this particular event and also the audience that I have the honor to address today has also something to do with the changes in my life. Changes that occurred very briefly after the 9th of November, because when on the 9th of November, in what was then East Berlin, in the evening, I was able to witness the fall of the wall on Bornholmer Straße and immediately took the opportunity and just crossed the street to the other side, as it were. I was a natural scientist at the time, a physicist at the Academy of Sciences, the Central Institute for Physical Chemistry, as it was called then. I did not go to the Kudamm, but the next morning I went to Adlershof again, back to my place of work. I did not immediately want to sort of put my head on my desk and try to sleep off the lack of sleep during the night, so I did come back in due course. The fall of the wall at the time changed my life almost completely, but it certainly did not put a damper on my love for science. I no longer am as knowledgeable as I used to be, so I put in a little bit more emotion into it to compensate. But the world of science has a very important priority in my work as a politician. It's so interesting to see that this yearning for freedom, the courage to stand up for freedom, has time and again allowed for great changes to occur. And so the 9th of November is a very symbolic date in German history. Dream and trauma are connected with this particular date, but the 9th of November 1989 in many ways allowed a dream to come true. Many were instrumental in making this possible. It would not have been possible, however, without the courage of the people in the then German Democratic Republic, no matter whether they had decided at the time to leave and to leave their home country and to show that they were not convinced at all about the merits of the system, or whether they decided to try to combat the system from within. Both forms of resistance were important in order to bring about the collapse of that system. And this, together with the courage that we had seen on display in Poland, the free elections of the June of 1989, the courage that was also shown all the way to the all the way up to the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and the many other instances that we saw, particularly in the Central and Eastern European countries at the very end of that period, in Romania, where dictatorship was existent in a particularly harsh push for. When tonight the heads of state and government of virtually all of the member states of the European Union will be our guests here in Berlin, that this very clearly illustrates what we saw first on Bornholmer Straße on the 9th of November, then at other border crossing points. The Brandenburg Gate, after all, was only opened in December, namely the fact that this was a European event, a collapse of one part of what was until that point in time a bipolar system, and democracy and freedom, the principles of market economy had actually vanquished, had defeated the lack of freedom and a command economy. The fact that this came about was probably even more due to science than many think today. Because, after all, the fall of the wall also came about, well, it came about because people showed courage. They stood up for their rights, but they had also shown courage in the 50s, in the 60s, and time and again this unrest was put down. But what we saw here were, in many ways, the harbingers of what we call a science society and a knowledge society. The prosperity of a country, it was acknowledged, and the prosperity of a country, and this is something that was also seen in the time after the war in the Federal Republic of Germany, depends on, was made possible through innovation, through new thinking, through new technologies, international communication, and the possibility to exchange data in a different way than hitherto, in a way that wasn't all that easy to spy on. I mean, a letter could have been opened, you could read it. It was much more difficult to actually crack a computer technological data highway. And later on, what then happened was that in the East Bloc, too, in order to make further development possible, people were necessary who were able to think along different lines and who were able to network. And that was when a system hit at a ceiling, because you cannot tell people start thinking in the morning and then stop thinking at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and not think about the society, because then the dictatorship of the labor class is what's of the essence, and you have to be obedient and subservient to the system. And this was simply not possible. So there were two different groups of people. There were people who were very good scientists, very good scholars. Quite often they then tended to become dissidents. Some of them left the Republic. Or, on the other hand, you had people who were thinking very well, very freely, but who were reined in by the system, and who were hemmed in also by the fact that they thought, well, if I'm not allowed to think outside of my place of work, I will not think either during those 8 hours that I'm at my place of work, which is why foundries work well, the metal industry work well. But in those areas where new prosperity is engendered through new ideas, through new thinking, through innovation and new technology, it became more and more difficult for the Eastern Bloc to maintain its competitive edge. And this, I think, made a very big contribution towards freedom forging ahead. I'm not saying that all of that is due to lack of economic development or lack of technological development, but science certainly also did its bit and in order to convince people that they could not limit thinking completely. This is a good piece of news, because all systems, all structures that wish to be successful, and that is what this tells us, cannot live without freedom. Politicians have to deal with that fact. I'm sometimes looking from a different vantage point at matters today, because it makes lives as a politician rather difficult when people think freely, but it is, on the other hand, also much more pleasant, much more gratifying when the whole of society is also participating in thinking new policies. And this is what I think we also ought to remember in all those cases where walls these days prevent us from coexisting peacefully and living together peacefully on this planet. Today, we meet as a united people, as I said, on the signing of the 50th on the occasion of the signing of the treaties of Durham, the 50th anniversary, that this is a stroke of luck. Working together as free nations also means you have to show patience. Each and everyone needs to be convinced, needs to be won over. You can see that when you look at how we in the European Union do our work, but I cannot think of anything better than this way of going about it in the European Union, because if we look at how we shape policies today in this united Germany and think that this is a good way of going about it, and we wish others to join us, then we Germans, with our 80 million people, will not be able to go it alone anymore. The world has 6.5 billion people, and there is a growing world population. It is true that in Europe, at the beginning of the 20th century, every fourth person in the world lived in Europe. At the end of this century, however, only every 13th inhabitant of this planet will be a European, not to speak of the Germans. So if we Europeans actually want to bring our political weight to bear, if we want to inject new ideas into this world of today, we would be very well advised to cooperate with others and to do that in concert with others. This goes, incidentally, for science and scientific development, just as for political projects. Quite a lot of things simply can no longer be done alone. But I think that we are in a very good situation today, and this good situation places us under an obligation. We need to contribute to come up with better solutions for the problems of this world. We have seen ourselves that the impossible suddenly becomes possible. That at least gives me time and again the strength to say, well, why not try the impossible in other places of the world? For example, in solving the Middle East process or fighting international terrorism, the great challenges of our times. Here we have to chart completely new courses. We have to think of new and creative ways to tackle that. During the Cold War time, the world was split in two. It was rather predictable what might happen. And these two different camps had just one objective. They wanted to ensure their own survival. They wanted to win in this conflict, but each side did not want to encourage own annihilation. If you look at the asymmetrical threat we face today, that is quite a different threat, a threat of a different nature, because there are quite a number of people who are willing to sacrifice their own lives to serve what they perceive as a good cause. So this simple principle of deterrence, as it worked in the Cold War, is no longer working today. So we have to chart new courses, and we are doing so slowly. We're trying to probe for new ways and means as to how we counter these asymmetrical threats, those who are willing to commit terrorist acts. How can we master them by using democratic means? And this is a fight we haven't yet won. But we cannot shirk that responsibility either, because what is hidden behind that is a perception of man where each individual is not worth anything, where democracy's power, where they wish to erode democracy's power and wish to destroy it, as we've seen on 9/11. So let us not shirk that responsibility. Let us try to forge new policies, chart new courses, other courses than the ones that were appropriate for the Cold War time. We all know from our history that the capacity to show tolerance is one of the preconditions for actually being able to live on this planet as friends and partners. Tolerance doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean you question certain basic values, but it's quite difficult to actually show it, because tolerance means putting yourself into other people's shoes, trying to think as they think, trying to look at history the way they look at history, look at what they have, what the experience of the other person, and understand from that background why that person is acting in a particular way, and try to forge ahead together. And this capacity was something that was lost to us for many decades, even centuries in Europe, where people only thought of in terms of their own vested interest or in terms of their own national interests. Today, it's very interesting when you have discussions around the table among partners of the European Union, how difficult it sometimes is, and also how much knowledge is demanded from us about the history and culture and civilization of other countries. I well understand when the Czech President Klaus wishes to have an annex added to the Lisbon Treaty. But then when we come to property rights and the Cypriot president says, well, but he also has an issue with the Turkish part of Cyprus, then immediately you see that we simply do not know all that much about the intricacies of these property issues between one part of Cyprus and the other part of Cyprus, and how to evaluate the Turkish interjections on that issue. So you have to learn as much as possible if you want to tear down these modern walls about the rest of the world. I think that is one of the big walls that are still dividing us in this globalized world. Quite often we have difficulties to actually ask the right questions. And learning to ask the right questions, learning to ask for the right kind of information, the African continent, the Asian continent, know it as well as we know our European home continent. That is the basic precondition for being actually generally tolerant without giving up your own values. And I think this generation, if I may talk about my generation, I know many of you in the audience are much younger than I am, we are not all that well prepared for this, because in our way of thinking, we are very much determined by this bipolar world. I know in the then GDR, African geography was actually quite a simple thing. Every second African state was more or less still under the influence of the Americans, and the rest was under the influence of the Russians. I know quite a lot about those that were under the Soviet influence. The others, well, we were neither taught about them in geography nor in any other class in school. It's not that easy any longer, because these countries, because of the collapse of the Soviet Empire and because there is no longer a Cold War, also try to chart their own course, go their own way. This gives rise to tribal conflicts, to post-colonial conflicts, and so we have to know a little bit more about their history in order to give a valuable contribution to peace process, for example. Now, when we talk about Eritrea and Somalia, and they are being at loggerheads, and we don't know about the intricacies of that particular conflict, it's difficult for us. But I must say that I am sometimes almost envious looking at young people who actually grow up in this new world and perhaps develop a much better understanding of this planet as our one world, where we all need to solve, all need to do our bit to solve these conflicts. Then we have to tear down the wall between how we see the world ought to look like and what future generations demand from us. We have a lot of challenges here in financial and economic policy, just as in environmental policy. A peaceful coexistence will only be possible if we are able to develop a global order, a global framework. Then we have to ask ourselves, is it sufficient for governments to cooperate, for example, in the international economic and financial crisis? We Europeans tend to say that this is intergovernmental cooperation, each country sort of forging its own policy and then trying to enter with other governments in by more or less bilateral or multilateral agreements. But in order to tackle these new challenges successfully, should we not also transfer at least a part of our sovereignty to international organizations? We Europeans are quite used to that. We don't always necessarily love what Brussels tells us to do, but we voluntarily transferred quite a lot of competences to Brussels. There's no national agricultural German policy to speak of. Actually, in its original version, the European Community, as it was at the time, was very much one geared towards coal and steel and agriculture. And we are adding new parts of policy to this But it's much more difficult, for example, for our American partners to transfer a few competences, for example, to the IMF or other international organizations. You are a member, obviously, of the United Nations, but you have veto power to actually accept majority voting. And the ruling of others is something that the Americans are not all that used to. In the European Union, we're not doing this on foreign policy, we're not doing it on taxes, but in many other areas, Germany simply has to accept when its position is voted down by the majority of the others. So overcoming walls, that will also depend, our capacity to do that will also depend on nation states being capable and willing to transfer part of their sovereignty to multilateral international organizations, no matter what. We have examples of this kind. The World Trade Organization, for example, is a case in point. You have a panel of arbitration. There is no veto power over the ruling of this panel of arbitration. You then may well incur a ruling which means you have to pay certain fees for violating the General Code of Conduct, and that is something you have to accept too. In the post-Kyoto phase, where we are trying to bring forward an international agreement that allows us to do something against climate change, we have a similar case in point, because that, in many ways, is also an example of whether we are willing and able to enter into global agreements to counter international challenges. The upcoming conference in Copenhagen is going to be very important, but you don't have to be a prophet to say this will not be end of this process as we know it. It will have to be continued. This world will, I tell you, not be a peaceful planet if we do not accept more global cooperation, more multilateral cooperation. The new experience we have made is that Europe and the United States, even though they may agree, will no longer be able to go it alone, to solve these problems alone. After the end of during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, America and Europe could, by and large, solve most of the most pressing issues of the world. These days, issues such as climate change cannot be solved without the United States, and the Europeans will get Russia in on this as well. But if nobody else wishes to participate, then global temperatures will rise over and above the 2-degree Celsius target. So we need India, we need the emerging economies, which is actually a very good, a very gratifying result of the fall of the wall, of the end of the Cold War, that economic prosperity was possible in these emerging economies. This requires, however, to think in much more multipolar, in a much more multipolar way than we are used to. Many of you will have to deal with these new realities. How do we cope with countries, with regions that have completely different traditions, completely different political systems? But still we need to cooperate with them, and we wish to cooperate with them in order to tackle those global issues. How we will be able to use this wonderful experience that walls can actually be brought down, can be torn down. How can we use this in order to inject a bit of a momentum and then again not be seen as the sort of taskmaster of the rest of the world, or because they think quite differently. This is going to be our task for the future. The end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany and Europe, and the much better cooperation, coexistence with Russia. This end of the bipolar world actually opened a curtain, and behind this is not a well-ordered world, sort of a nirvana. We've seen completely new conflicts arise, but what still remains true, and that I find rather encouraging, it's also an encouraging experience connected with the 9th of November, what remains is our firm confidence that the individual is capable of living in freedom, freedom in responsibility, not freedom that robs others of their freedom to act. The individual can do enormous things. And encouraged by this experience, we ought to see globalization as an opportunity. Look at the many conflicts we need to face in the world of today and tackle them courageously. This means we have to again and again revise our way of thinking. We should not get bogged down in old patterns. These old patterns not only exist in politics, they also exist in science. It's quite surprising. I mean, in the past, from my small GDR and limited GDR perspective, I always thought that in a world of free science, of truly free science, everything is run along objective lines these days. You hear from professors who need to send students to other continents because they wish to tackle and attack the very roots of what has become established and convenient truth here in the world of science, and they are simply not satisfied with this state of play. Please, I can only encourage you, be a role model to us politicians. What we need is a vibrant society, one that time and again makes it incumbent upon us to try for the impossible and the unthinkable. It's a good thing to see so many of you united here today, using the 9th of November to talk about wars of the world of today and to think, how can we bring them down? This is the kind of thinking that we need for these new challenges. I wish you every success, and at the same time, I wish you and all of us the capacity to simply enjoy what was possible on that 9th of November. To me, it is still a great source of joy, in spite of all of the problems in the world that I see have not been solved. I still do it today, and I will continue to do it in the future. Thank you very much.